Dear colleagues and friends in Chisinau, Moldova, a very warm hello to you all. And it is a great pleasure to be addressing you today within the Rockit Conference. Thank you very much, Artur and the team, for the invitation to join you today. And congratulations with this wonderful event. I think it is really fantastic to see so many speakers and so much insight, good insight, being shared with the broader community in Moldova. My name is Veronica Cretu. I am originally from Moldova myself. However, for the past couple of years, I've been working and living in Austria, where I lead the governance unit at the Innovating Governance Association. And I'm also an envoy to the Open Government Partnership, which is a global initiative that brings together 79 governments as of today. And Republic of Moldova joined this initiative back in 2011. For the purpose of this intervention today, I'm looking at an interesting issue, an interesting topic, and I will try to share with you my screen right now. I hope it works well. So the topic of my intervention is anchored in something which we are not being taught at school about. We don't talk about this too much at our workplace or in our workplaces, in our institutions, but it is extremely important, a very important aspect indeed, resilience. I will particularly focus on the need for super resilient governments these days, and honestly, frankly speaking, resilience is something um, each and every one of us is in desperate need for. So, in preparing for this presentation today, I deep dived a bit into a number of definitions why what resilience stands for. So, resilience is typically defined as capacity to recover from difficult life events, or the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad has happened to us. Um, in looking at issues of super resilience, or what super resilience would stand for, I have observed that both individuals, institutions, and communities are struggling today more than ever with the need to be able to cope with the evolutionary challenges and the emerging changes. We are witnessing rapidly changing environment these days, but also we are being affected by all sorts of hazardous things and phenomena such as natural disasters or pandemics like the COVID now. So the overall perception is that the current skill level might not be responding well to all these emerging trends and emerging challenges. Um, and as I mentioned already, the current pandemic, COVID-19, shows exactly how uncertain the future is. So we are certain about the uncertainty of the future and how much pressure is out there on our governments. The question that we have is, are our governments ready for this uncertain future? And are they able to cope with this, with the pressures emerging on a regular basis? So, super resilience would mean to be able to cope with these emerging challenges and to be able to upgrade the skills and the capacities to address those challenges. I found one interesting uh, description of resilience, and for me that would be super resilience for a governmental related context. It's anchored in the US national doctrine on resilience going back to 2017, which states specifically that resilience includes the ability to withstand and recover rapidly from deliberate attacks, accidents, natural disasters, as well as unconventional stresses, shocks, and threats to economy and democratic system. In preparing for this presentation, I tried to understand how the governments have been addressing the issue of resilience, and across the globe, governments have been adopting national policy frameworks on resilience throughout the past decade. So it has been part of the exercise within a number of governments. If you look at the OECD countries, for example, 45 national policy frameworks are there in place, of which 39 of them mention the role of cities or subnational governments as being key for building national resilience and for strengthening the national policy frameworks on resilience. This national policy frameworks that I'm referring to emphasize collaboration with all levels of governments or government across all level of government as being one of the key drivers that helps ensure a coherent and integrated approach to resilience. Some frameworks on resilience include very specific roles and missions for cities, but I know my good friend and colleague from Bucharest, Radu Puciu, is going to have his presentation right after mine, and he is representing Happy Cities initiative, and I'm sure that Radu will talk more about the mission and the role of cities in this emerging agenda. Um, other frameworks, for example, the US framework or Japan, emphasize local authorities as being primarily responsible for building resilience. And if you look at the Israel's Sustainability Outlook 2030, it's a document that they developed in 2012. They aim at promoting intense cooperation and sharing of best practices across all levels of government. So these are, just to summarize on this, so as of today, governments across the world thinking about resilience. There are national policy frameworks on resilience, and depending on the country, the emphasis is being put on different nuances, such as collaboration, the role of local governments, role of cities, cooperation, sharing of best practices. So these are just the key common elements across these policy frameworks. Um, in moving forward, of course, one needs to understand and keep in mind that the pressures of the past years, if you think about the past 5 to 10 years, for example, and the challenges that the globe has been focusing on and addressing, such as pandemics, migration and brain drain, further growth in refugee movements, climate change, and whatever comes with climate change, political and economic disruption through cyber attacks and surveillance, a rise in income disparities, a heavy decline of citizens' trust in governments. All of these pressures are on the governments these days, and to be able to address this emerging pressures, one really needs to be resilient and really well prepared to address those. In looking at resilience per se, resilience in government, I tried to create the let's say a portrait of a resilient government, and I defined some really important characteristics. And today I will speak to some of these characteristics and why they are so important in building and framing government resilience. What you see here, this is a hypothetical portrait of a resilient government. As you see, it has scores. So you have a scoring system from 0 to 3 on each of these characteristics. And of course, what you have in front of you is a very unbalanced picture, because on some fronts, on some components or some characteristics, you see stronger, higher scores. It means that a particular government is strong in that particular area, while in others you see 0 or 0.5 or 1. This means that there is a lot still to be done in order to bring this portrait to a nice shape. So basically, this is how most of the government resilience looks like today is very unbalanced. Some are stronger on some sides, some are weaker on other sides, and there is a lot that needs to be done in order to build, and frame and shape this portrait of a resilient government. So there should be a balance, and when the balance is achieved, this means that resilience is there in place, and there is a lot of capacity to deal with and come out stronger, even stronger from a really tough and complicated scenarios and situations. So here I have a number of components, capacity to exercise foresight, long-term financial planning, disaster planning, appropriate level of unrestricted fund balance, comprehensive risk management plan, diversity, redundancy, decentralization, transparency, collaboration, failing gracefully, and flexibility and capacity to change and adapt. So I will speak today, I will share some of my thoughts and reflections on some of these components, giving some, I don't know, challenging you with some questions, and probably I would focus more the questions and the examples to the education sector, because we are dealing with covering education also in this particular event and in this particular track. As I mentioned, foresight is one of the key components. A resilient government is the one that it is not the one that necessarily should or could predict the future. But a resilient government is the one that can learn to use the evidence-based approaches and data in preparing for the future. In doing so, for a resilient government, it is important to be able to develop effective forecasting techniques and use scenario planning and modeling to show the impact of various possible futures. So we have a COVID right now. We have a pandemic that has significantly affected and impacted the way we operate, the way we live, the way we do business, the way we learn. And while on one hand we have had more access to online trainings and programs, we still see a lot of challenges coming out when it comes to the capacity to engage remotely, be it for the job-related purposes or for education-related purposes. But imagine a situation in which you have a pandemic and there is a natural disaster that leads to lack of power, no electricity across several regions in the country. Then how would the online learning and education work out in this particular case? Or assume half of the children have no access to basic gadgets. So in the internet governance world, we speak a lot about the importance of access to access. So imagine half of the children lack access to access and are not able to properly engage in a situation like this. Or assume ISPs, internet service providers, increase their connectivity costs, and affordability for remote teaching versus learning becomes a very important issue. So foresight is extremely important because it allows government officials, public servants, to think through questions like this ones and to be able to strategize and provide diagnosis on strategic issues at sector-specific levels and across sectors. So the more exercises of this kind, of this sort, and scenario planning and modeling we have within the government, within specific sectors, the more likely it is that when a pandemic or when a critical uh, disaster happens, the government is much more able to function and to operate, because it would be ready with one, two, three scenarios. It would have already a clear vision what scenario would be feasible, a workable one, and which one would not be. But definitely for foresight, and data has been mentioned already throughout the event so many times. For the foresight to be a really meaningful exercise, one needs to be using a lot of data and have access to really accurate and good data in place. National data portals are a really good tool, a vital tool in this exercise. So those who have been engaged in the open data agenda, I think it is really important to bring out this message that data is not only for the purpose of being out there on the portal, but it is helpful for the government internally to be able to do this sort of scenario planning and modeling and foresight. Um, in moving forward, another important element, as you saw in the broader portrait, is long-term financial planning and viability. And what does it mean? Resilient governments regularly engage in long-term financial planning, and they recognize the importance of disaster preparedness and management. Well, in some instances, we may see governments doing it just and ticking the boxes. There is a plan in place. They are aware that the pandemic is coming, and still they are not yet fully prepared to manage the disaster. And I have been listening to several government representatives and agencies, disaster risk management agencies from around the world, saying that we knew that something is coming, but where we really prepared for that. Well, long-term financial planning helps project certain resources and allocation of certain resources should something like a disaster occur. Local governments are really playing a critical role in containing a disaster such as a pandemic, for example. Um, and they play a vital role in producing sustainable communities and mitigating the effects of disasters. Of course, for that to happen, we need local governments to incorporate resilience as a component into their strategic planning processes. For countries like Moldova, with local governments still going through a lot of learning and experimentation when it comes to development of community strategic action plans. I think here there is a window of opportunity for them to rethink, in the context of the current pandemic, rethink how and in what way communities could become more sustainable and more resilient. And here development partners, because I know many development partners are out there on the ground providing support to our local governments in designing this strategic action plans. So development partners and foreign aid should be on board with such processes at country level, and they should signal and they should provide support to local governments to incorporate resilience solutions into those strategic action plans. Um, Another element here that I want to touch on is the fact that if you are a resilient government, you would have a formal policy on the level of unrestricted fund balance, which is generally maintained in the general fund, and these resources could be deployed to address stringent needs in really critical situations. For example, I mentioned the fact that we may have a situation in which children cannot people don't have access to access. So this unrestricted funds would be aiming to provide additional support for remote learning, for example, or assisting parents with childcare, or providing healthcare providers with necessary equipment. So a resilient government is the one that has all this means, and is prepared at any time, 24 out of 24, to be able to deploy such resources should they be needed. Um, if we continue building the portrait of a resilient government, diversity is something in the picture, because resilient governments avoid relying on a single solution. So for a government who is resilient, there are more than two or three solutions, good solutions in place. They use multifaceted approach to financial health, as it has been already mentioned, and they usually consider other elements than revenues and expenditures, for example, land uses or demographics or others. So a resilient government is also one that diversifies its communication, and it speaks clear language. It reaches out to every single citizen, and it speaks in a language that is clear, that is not terminology heavy, especially in critical times. Or the government speaks several languages if that is needed, again, depending on the context and on the country. Um, Diversity is also embedded in the way government broadens and deepens its engagement with various stakeholder groups. And diversity is at the heart of a resilient government. It's encouraged in everything. For example, if we make a reference to education sector, a resilient government is the one that encourages a wide variety or typology of schools. It encourages different types of schools, and schools are independent to decide on what to teach and how to teach and where to teach. Because in a critical situation, you don't end up with the whole system being shut down. You still have, due to the variety and due to the broad typology of schools, for example, you still have the opportunity to provide education for all. So diversity is key. Redundancy is another aspect, which is really, really important. Resilient governments have more than one path of escape. Again, if we talk about financial planning, because this is so important, they institutionalize financial planning through governance practice like financial policies. They understand, resilient governments understand that this is something that helps them make good practice continue regardless the transitions in government. We all know that transitions in governments have been severely affecting reforms after the reforms, and it is so important that governments keep building on the previous efforts, without deleting, without abolishing what has been done before, but on the contrary, strengthening and consolidating efforts that have been put in place, resources that have been used to build certain systems. Engaging citizens in financial planning is something at the heart of resilient governments. Citizens' budgets, participatory budgeting done face to face or via the e-government tools make citizens recognize the value of financial planning and demand it from their governments. Again, if we are to make a parallel to our school systems, for example, in schools, one could start prototyping and experimenting with different models in which pupils can be engaged in planning their activities, resources, their time, so they can do it together with their peers and school staff, so that they learn how to plan, how to project, and how to demand accuracy and demand finances when those are necessary for a certain type of activities. So you start these processes early, from the early days in the education system, and this is a good way to avoid redundancy coming up over and over again throughout the system. Decentralization is another really important aspect and characteristic of resilient government, because um, resilient governments understand that centralized systems might look strong, but they also acknowledge that when they fail, the failure is catastrophic. So, resilient government support managers of key public institutions and structures, regardless of whether it's health sector, education, social sector, local government, to manage their costs and encourage revenues generating activities so that the budget does not depend on centralized system fully. So this creates also a sort of strategic financial thinking across the system, and it also improves the quality of the forecast and the credibility of public institutions. This is how innovation really, innovative approaches get up to life. Because without a decentralized approach, one cannot really innovate much in the public sector. If we again make a parallel to the education system, decentralization in education definitely brings better, higher quality, generates greater outcomes, and gives a chance to everyone to compete on equal basis, regardless of whether this is a rural school or an urban school, regardless of whether this is a capital city or somewhere remote area. So a decentralized system provides the opportunity for everyone to be on an equal footing within the certain framework and within the certain context. Transparency and accountability, I think this has been on everyone's mind, particularly with COVID and with the need to have transparency around how the money is being spent on equipment and on healthcare overall. So resilient governments, they open up. They don't hide their systems. They believe in openness, and transparency is again something at the core of their modus operandi. They understand that with transparency, it is much more easier to identify a problem or an issue, and accordingly, this helps them as government entities and agencies to find better solutions. So they share their plans and strategic visions and documents through various platforms, such as social media, dedicated governmental platforms, door to door, through public meetings. They listen when people point out challenges or flaws. So transparency is something that helps improve the system. If we make a parallel to the school system, for example, imagine pupils having access to various means and forms to express themselves or to bring out their insights, and this could be done through committees, scorecards, wish trees, thematic groups, voting platforms, you name it. So transparency and accountability is seen by resilient governments as the only ways to build trust among citizens and to be able to serve their citizens much better. Collaboration is another critical element of the portrait of a resilient government, because they work together with their constituencies, and this is something that helps them become stronger. Governmental plans and priorities get more support from citizens if they have had the previous buy-in into those processes. We are much more likely to accept an idea if we were asked in advance about that idea or one initiative or another. So co-creating, co-designing public policies, having inclusive approach to policymaking is again at the core of the modus operandi of resilient governments. They don't work in silo, they open up, they broaden the spaces for engagement and collaboration, and this is really key. So the ideal case scenario, or the ideal portrait of a resilient government would look like this. Yeah, it would have highest scores on each and every single component that we have just gone through. And with this in place, there are much more chances that governments would invest in their citizens and accordingly would be building bridges together with their citizens, bridges for better services, bridges for better solutions in critical times, bridges for better communication, for listening and hearing each other. And this is exactly what resilient governments do. They invest in their people, in their citizens, and they place the citizen at the core of everything that is going on. So the citizen is the one that benefits the most out of this resilient approach. Um, with this, I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be talking to you today and sharing some of my visions and reflections on resilience. And I think resilience starts from each and every one of us. If we say I can do it, if we say I can try, if we say I can open up, I can be more transparent, I can be more diverse, I can incorporate diversity, I can collaborate better. If we do it as individuals, if we do it as institutions, we have much more chances to generate this bottom up pressure on the governments to open up, to become more resilient, and to always say and reply to us, yes, we can do it. So, thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure to be addressing you today. Over to you, and enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you very much, and warm regards from Austria.